Hey guys, in today's video, I'm going to talk to you guys about the 20 most important things to remember in watercolor painting. And I'm going to go from least important to most important, so be sure to pay attention to the very end. And just remember to subscribe to my channel. I upload new videos every week. And if you're interested in learning from me more in depth, join my Patreon. All right, let's get going with number one. The first thing that I would suggest to keep in mind when you're painting watercolor is, in general, when you're painting watercolor, paint from light to dark, which means with watercolor, once you put down a dark color, it's really hard to erase that or paint over it. It just doesn't work in watercolor. So that's why you have to work from light to dark, which means paint your lights first, your whites very first, and you always save your whites and you paint around them. So the white in your painting will be the watercolor paper. And so you start with your whites and your lights, and then your mediums, and then your darks. So that is why in watercolor, you generally have to work from light to dark. Now, I break that rule all the time because I like to paint in my darks and then paint with more watery color on top of them, because the water actually softens the edges of my darks. So sometimes that's how I work, but that is somewhat breaking a rule of watercolor. All right, tip number 2 of painting with watercolor. In order to make watercolor paint lighter, you add water, or you paint on paper that is watered, has water on the surface or moisture on the surface. So the more water you add to your watercolor paint, the lighter the paint will look when you paint it on your paper. And one thing to keep in mind too is that when the watercolor paint dries, it's going to dry lighter. So keep in mind when you're painting, if you want something to have a medium value, as in a medium darkness, then you have to paint it a little darker than you might think you need to get it a little darker. And a lot of times with darks, you have to do several layers to get a really dark with watercolor paint. Be sure to watch my video on tea, milk, and cream consistency paint, which goes more in depth with how to use these different consistencies in watercolor paint to get different effects. All right, number 18, use grays. So you will hear all the time about how you should avoid having mud in your painting, which is true, but also remember the importance of grays, because watercolor is a medium that can produce beautiful eye-popping color. And one of the ways to create that eye-popping color is to provide some contrast against it, which means using gray. So don't be afraid to use grays in your watercolor painting. They kind of provide a supporting role to the more colorful areas of your painting. Another tip I have about painting with watercolor in particular is do it a lot. You're going to have to practice a lot. Watercolor is one of the hardest mediums to learn how to use, and it's a little tricky. You have to learn how to control the amount of water on your brush and on your paper, and how to mix, and then the colors might get muddy. So there is a lot to learn in watercolor painting. So don't get frustrated too early on, because it is a learning process. I've been painting for 20 years and I'm still learning. So just know that you're going to have to paint a lot, practice a lot, and then practice some more. And another good thing to do, especially if you're starting out or doing a more complicated painting, is to paint the same thing several times. Every time the painting will come out different. And I've done a few paintings recently where I repainted a subject that I painted years ago, and I was trying to make it look the same. And even for me, I wasn't able to make it look the same as that painting. And every single time I painted it, it came out quite differently. So just know that every time you paint something, it's going to teach you something, and you will learn in the process. So it's important to keep learning, experiment, study art that you really admire, and get a subscription to a watercolor magazine or join forums online and look at other people's art. Think about why you like their art and how you can incorporate what you like about others' art into your own. Okay, number 15. One mistake that I see a lot of new watercolor artists make is their paintings just look kind of stiff, but it's hard to say why. But one of the reasons why might be using too much masking. So if you use masking, it's a great tool. Masking is something that you use. It's a liquid. You paint it onto your paper, and then anything underneath that paper, the paper underneath the masking will stay white. So you use it to save whites. For example, if you're painting a cat, you use masking for the whiskers or the glint in the eye or some small little detail that would be hard to paint around. So masking can be a great tool, but if you overuse it, it will make your painting look stilted. So don't use it too much. Now, everyone knows that I'm an advocate, especially when you're beginning, to use tracing to help you get a drawing more accurate so your painting looks more realistic. But on the other hand, you do need to learn how to draw. And the one big trick to learning how to draw well is to think in terms of shapes instead of thinking in terms of what you're painting. So when you're painting different areas, such as a cat, think in terms of, okay, this little shadow on his cheek is a triangle, or that eye is has a triangular shape at the top and maybe an oval shape on the bottom. So think in terms of shapes when you're painting and really look at your reference photo and paint what you see, not what you think you see. And it's really a switch in your brain, and you can almost feel it happening when your brain switches over to looking at the shapes instead of looking at whatever the picture really is, like this is a cat's nose. Instead, your brain can switch over and say, oh, this is a rectangle that is about this long compared to this shape up here. So you will learn to compare shapes in your reference photo instead of looking at what that reference photo is a picture of. Another tip you can use to really make your watercolor painting special is learn how to use your whites. Whites can add a really nice sparkle to a painting and keep it looking fresh. So be sure to use your whites judiciously and don't use too much white in contrast in areas you don't want the viewer's eye to look at. And for me, I usually use my brightest whites in the face. Usually I'm painting an animal. Almost, 8 out of 10 paintings of mine are of an animal. And so I use whites to draw the viewer's attention to the animal's face. In the eyes, I put the glint, or I'll use the whites of the whiskers to kind of draw the viewer's eye into the face. So use your whites to add sparkle and interest, and know that your whites, wherever you put them, will attract the viewer's attention, which leads to tip number 12, jewelry. Use jewelry in your painting. What is jewelry? Well, on a cat's face, it's the little tiny whiskers, the little tiny details in the face, the glint in the eye. On a human portrait, it might be the sparkle in the eye or some wisps of hair coming over the face, or some small little detail in the area of interest to really make it look more realistic and more detailed. And if you use too much jewelry in a painting, it will look stilted or overdone. Just like if I wore too much jewelry, if I had on this necklace and earrings and a bunch of bangles and rings, it would look overwhelming and it would detract from the painting. At the same time, if I just have on one little simple necklace and maybe some earrings, I could maybe use some earrings, but just a little bit of jewelry makes the painting look really nice. So keep that in mind when you're painting and plan for adding a little bit of jewelry to the painting. Another thing that really helped me as a watercolor painter, that really helped me develop as a watercolor painter, was joining a community. I joined a community early on when I first started painting, and it was invaluable. I learned so much information about just basics, how to ship art, how to print it, the kind of the more nuts and bolts side of watercolor painting, what boards to use to paint on, different art supplies that were really handy. And I'm always still learning so much from my fellow artists, and it's an invaluable resource for me to have artist friends and to be parts of online communities that help me learn and support me and encourage me. So I encourage you to join a community, whether it's on Facebook or Reddit, YouTube forums, wherever you can find an online community, join one and be active in that community. Provide support, and you will also receive a lot of invaluable support to help you get started as an artist. Another thing to keep in mind when you're painting is a painting can get frustrating and it goes through the ugly stage. Be sure to watch my ugly stage painting. In fact, I have a whole playlist for it's targeted towards it's targeted towards young artists and artists just starting out in watercolor. My watercolor basics playlist can help you learn the basics of watercolor to get you up on your feet. But tip number 10 is to let a painting rest. It can get really overwhelming. It will go through an ugly stage almost always. And I see a lot of beginning artists stop at the ugly stage thinking they've reached the end when no, you haven't reached the end. It's just at the ugly stage, and it's a scary stage, and you panic. I still do that. I get to an ugly stage in a painting and I panic. But keep going, keep pushing. And I have a whole video about how to get your painting out of the ugly stage. So be sure to watch that. And just know that most paintings go through an ugly stage, and a lot of beginners, I think they get to the ugly stage and they panic and they just think that they're just a beginner and they're no good, but they just maybe need to try to keep pushing the painting. So keep pushing the painting. That being said, you might get to a place where you've overworked the painting, and then, hey, lesson learned. You learn, and as you develop as an artist, you'll learn what's the ugly stage and what is overworking the painting. So when you get to this stage, sometimes it's best to actually stop painting and put the painting away for a day, a week, a month, so that you can go back to it with fresh eyes and look at it and see what it needs. So that is my tip. That is my tip number 10, to let a painting rest and to think, sleep on it. Don't keep pushing when you're feeling frustrated. Just put it away for a little bit and come back to it with fresh eyes. Okay, tip number 9 for my new artists out there who might not understand all the copyright laws. They're kind of confusing and complex. But just know that when you use a reference photo that you find on the internet or from whatever resource you find, make sure that it's copyright free, that you're allowed to use it. If you're not sure, contact the person who took the picture and ask them for permission. Let them know what you plan to do with the picture. If you can sell it, just get permission first before you use a picture that you yourself didn't take. And sometimes it's a lot simpler to just use your own pictures, but a lot of times I go onto picture websites like Flickr. I'll look at Instagram, I'll look at groups on Facebook, and I'll find pictures that I just have to paint. And if it's not from one of these free reference photo Facebook groups or something similar to that, where the pictures are there for artists to use, I always ask permission from the person who took the picture, and I ask them if I can use the picture. And lately, since I'm doing tutorials, I let them know, hey, I'm doing this tutorial. My students will be painting it too. Is that okay? So I make sure they understand what I want to use the picture for. So that also goes for when you're painting from tutorials. If you are painting a tutorial from something you find on YouTube, like one of my tutorials, you always want to give credit to the person who made the tutorial and the painting, because that was their reference photo, that was their painting. So if you're copying their painting and then putting it up on social media, Facebook, you want to make sure you give them credit and say, hey, I did this painting from a tutorial. Now, if you change the painting and it looks totally different from the tutorial's outcome, then you can take the credit and say, yes, I painted this. But if your painting looks like the tutorial you painted from, then you want to make sure to give your art instructor their due credit. Tip number 8 to watercolor painting is learn how to control your water. This is probably the hardest and most complex part of watercolor painting, and this is the part that you've got to practice. How much water do you have on your paper? How much water do you have on your brush? This can have a myriad of combinations. You might be painting on dry paper and you might have a lot of water in your brush, or you might have a pretty dry brush and dry paper, or very wet paper and a very wet brush. They all have very different effects to how the watercolor will dry and how it will look in the end. So just learn how to control the amount of water on your paper and in your brush. And an in general rule is you don't want puddles ever, hardly ever, on your watercolor paper, and you don't want your watercolor brush completely dripping. So something a little bit drier than those two options, and you're gonna have a better outcome. But it does depend on how you want to have your edges look and how you want your painting to look. So I did a tutorial on my push technique where you use a little bit of water dripped in between thicker areas of paint that creates interesting fur textures. So be sure to check that out. That's a good example of how to use water. Tip number 7 is to remember to attach your subject to the background. Now, I mostly paint animals, so I assume that most of the people watching this video like to paint animals and portrait type subjects. So this might not apply if you're painting a landscape, but the rule about attachment applies even in landscape, and that is to make sure that different elements in your painting hang together well. And for me, for example, when I'm painting a cat in front of a background, I always try to find a place of attachment, which means you look for a place where the fur of the cat is the same value or darkness as the background, or similar enough that you can attach them. I did this recently in my painting of the Siamese cat on hot press paper, and the cat's looking this way, and the back of his neck, I made a completely disappearing edge, and that kind of attaches the animal to the background. Why is this important? Because you don't want your subject to look like a cutout. You want them to look like they are part of a painting. So that is where lost and blurry edges come in really handy. And when I look at all of my favorite paintings by artists I really admire, I notice that they always have soft and disappearing edges that make them look dreamy and interesting and soft. So that is something that I always look to do in my paintings, is to attach the animal to the background. Now, for example, here's another painting I recently did, and this is a challenging subject to attach to the background because it's a black cat on a white background, but I still did it subtly by when I painted this shadow here, I painted the shadow right up into the cat so they attached and create a really soft edge here where the shadow is under the cat, and also here at the tail I made a really soft edge, and this painting is full of soft edges. So that helps too when you're trying to attach your subject to the background. If you can't completely have a disappearing edge, it was impossible with this painting. Soft edges really help attach the subject to the background as well, which is tip number 6, have good edges. And to get good edges, that usually means have soft edges, and you want a variety of edges. And typically in the main point of interest, you have more hard edges, and in less important parts of the painting, like down in the edges or the corners, where the viewer is not going to spend most of their time, you have softer edges. And those soft edges help the viewer's eye understand to keep moving along right on through those soft edges till they get caught up in your small details, your hard edges, and your interesting contrast in the key area of interest. Usually, if it's of an animal looking at the viewer, for example, it's going to be the eyes. That's why I always make sure I put the jewelry in the eyes. The edges are important in a painting to help the viewer's eye know where to travel. So the soft edges keep the eye moving around the painting, which is what you want to happen. And it just gives it a soft, dreamy look that you just can't achieve if you have a bunch of hard edges everywhere. Okay, tip number 5 for a good watercolor painting is having beautiful light. And you know the light is beautiful at what they call the golden hour. When the sun is low on the horizon, it makes the shadows longer and it makes the shadows look less harsh and soft, and the light just has a beautiful glow to it. And if you can get good light on your subjects, especially if you're painting animals, usually that's from the animal maybe sitting in a window, that can create really beautiful light. Or if you're outside taking pictures when the sun is lower on the horizon, can make beautiful light. The ugliest light comes from flash photography because everything gets kind of washed out and then edges look really sharp and harsh, and it's just not an attractive lighting setup. So avoid using a reference photo taken with a flash at all costs. Number 4, values. Values is more important than color. I haven't spent a lot of time on my channel talking about color mixing and things like that because I think the much more important thing is values. And if you get your values right, the color is going to be a lot less important. So a common mistake I see with beginning artists is they're afraid to get their darks really dark. So you want to get your darks dark. You want to make sure there's contrast in your painting. And you want to make sure there's a little bit of each value in your painting. You want some lights, some pure white, you want some mediums, and you want some darks, and usually in different amounts. So you want a lot of dark, a tiny little bit of light, and a medium amount of mediums, or a lot of mediums and a tiny touch of dark and a medium amount of light. So you just want to vary the amounts of your values as well, but you want to make sure that you cover all your bases and have each value in your painting. All right, tip number 3 is use tracing. And all of my followers know that I really suggest using tracing as a tool as an artist. Drawing and painting are 2 different skill sets. It can be really overwhelming for a new artist to try to learn both skills at the same time because drawing is very hard for your brain to learn how to do correctly, and painting is a lifelong pursuit where you'll always be learning new things. So to try to pile both those things together when you're first starting out is really hard. Now, for me and my path as a child and a teenager, I drew all the time. So I already had a pretty strong foundation in drawing when I started painting. So that really helped me. I had been drawing a lot. And then when I started painting, I switched over to stop drawing and using tracings and what we artists call transferring an image. Doesn't that sound more professional? We transfer the image. Because what happens, you will find, even if you transfer your image onto your watercolor paper, once you get that first wash on, you're still going to have to rely very heavily on your drawing skills. So don't feel like you're cheating. Using a transfer, using a tracing at the beginning of your painting is simply a tool to rely on to get the main gist of your subject onto the paper. But after that, you will have to use your drawing skills. And so I highly recommend that you learn how to draw and learn how to switch your brain over to seeing the shapes in your reference photo instead of what is the photo of, like, am I painting a zebra? No, I'm painting this triangle here that creates the ear, and I'm painting this oval that creates the eye, and really looking at the shapes. And a good book to help you learn how to do this is by Nita Engel, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. I highly recommend anyone endeavoring to start a painting career or start painting to read that book and learn how to draw. It is a very important skill to have. Okay, the number 2 most important thing in watercolor painting, having a successful watercolor painting, is having a good reference photo. If your reference photo doesn't inspire you, isn't beautiful, doesn't have a good balance of lights, darks, and mediums, doesn't have good lines and edges where there's lots of curves, and if there's a lot of straight edges, like I was painting a cat and the cat was laying on a radiator and his leg was hanging down, but in the reference photo, it hung straight down and made a very straight edge right down the middle of the painting, and it wasn't a good composition. So I changed the angle of the leg to be more diagonal. So when you're using a reference photo, try to find a reference photo where it's already a pretty good composition and you don't have to do too much work to figure out how to make it look good as a painting, which means it has good light, it has good edges and curves, and the composition is nice. So a reference photo is 80% of the battle when you're trying to make a beautiful painting. All right, you guys, are you guys ready for what I believe is the most important thing to a successful watercolor painting? To me, the number one most important thing for your watercolors to be successful is to work with good paper. If you paint on cardboard or really cheap surface, your experience of painting watercolor will be completely different. It's almost like using a different medium if you don't paint on good quality watercolor paper. I personally prefer Arches cold press 140-pound paper. That's what I use, but you can experiment with a lot of different papers, and each paper that you try is going to give you fairly significantly big differences in your result, and your painting will look like a completely different painting. And to see what I mean, watch my video that I just did of my Siamese cat on hot press paper and see how different it looks than my versions on cold press paper. And I also did a lot of exercises recently of this exact painting. I did it on Yupo, I did it on hot press, I did it on cold press, and each painting looks so different. So just be aware of that. And if you're starting out as a watercolor artist, I would try a lot of different papers, which is what I did. But I landed on Arches cold press watercolor paper as my hands down favorite paper to work with. Kiki, do you want to say hello? Here's the star of the show, the real star of the show. You want to say hi? Yes, Kitty. All right, you guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope this was helpful and gave you an idea of what are the most important things when you're learning watercolor painting and how to make your painting successful. And be sure to subscribe. I upload a new video every week. If you want to learn from me more in depth, go check out my Patreon, and I will see you guys next week. Okay, thanks so much, you guys. Bye. Ow! Are you mad at me, Kitty? I'm kind of afraid to put my face too close to her. She will bite my nose. I love you though, Kitty. Don't bite my toe, Kitty. Bye, you guys.